Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. We're continuing our conversation with Nauvoo crime expert Mary Ann Clements. In our next conversation, we're going to talk more about the counterfeiters who turned out to be murderers. Yes, it's some pretty interesting and crazy stuff that happened. We'll also find out that some of these counterfeiting charges were pinned on church leaders and are part of the reason they left in the winter of February 1846. You won't want to miss this conversation. Check it out.
So we've established that there was counterfeiting going on. We've established that there was criminal gangs.
So 3 gangs, the Joseph Jackson, Edward Bonney, and who was the third one?
We know Peter Hawes did some counterfeiting, and he was a member of the church. But we do know, based on some statements that happened later on in winter quarters, someone said that he had admitted he'd been involved in counterfeiting in Nauvoo. And I suspect, so that's why my belief is there were probably at least 3 different counterfeiting operations that had occurred in Nauvoo. Then in the summer of 1845, so now after Joseph Smith dies, you know, there is this whole idea of counterfeiting. If people know about the governor's troops coming in, that's one reason the governor's troops were going to go into Nauvoo, is Joseph H. Jackson had told the governor that he could tell him, that he could show him where the counterfeiting presses were in Nauvoo. And so when the governor brings in the troops, that's what the Mormons are like. Ostensibly, they were coming in looking for counterfeiting presses. Well, yeah, because there were counterfeiting presses in Nauvoo. But so that is an element that people tend to kind of overlook a little bit. It wasn't just a random excuse. There was evidence of counterfeiting. And in fact, we get something that happens later, some people talking about how they had actually hid Bonney's 2 presses. At this time, they had to get him out of his house and hide him somewhere else so that the governor's troops wouldn't find them. So in the fall, after Joseph Smith is killed, in the fall, there are these questions of were the Mormons counterfeiting in Nauvoo? And so the grand jury in Hancock County actually hears testimony, and they bring in this Dr. Williams, Abiathar Buck Williams, and they ask him, was there counterfeiting going on in Nauvoo? And he's like, well, yes, Joseph Smith asked me to keep a press in my house, but it was the Mormons, and I was afraid because they would kill me if I didn't do it. But it was all Joseph Smith. And of course, Joseph Smith's dead by this point. And so Dr. Williams, he would not name anyone else. He refused to name anyone else. He would only name Joseph Smith, who was already dead. And so Hancock County is like... So they couldn't prosecute anyone. They couldn't come out with any indictments against anyone because this Dr. Williams wouldn't implicate anyone else in it. So then we get into the summer of 1845. And there's a lot of criminal gang activity that gets exposed in Nauvoo, summer of 1845. The first problem is... we get what's called the Miller-Lisi murders over in Lee County, Iowa. So Lee County is directly across the river from Nauvoo. And so you have 3 guys from Nauvoo who are all Mormon go over, and they're robbing people at night. They're coming in, they're scaring people, they're trying to rob them. There's all these robberies happening. One of the robberies goes bad. And it's this German minister, John Miller, and he has him and his wife, and then he has his 2 daughters and their husbands all in the house. These guys came in, William and Stephen Hodges, and this guy Thomas Brown. They all come into the house, and they're like threatening them, and they're saying they're going to kill him if they don't give him all the money, because they've heard that this guy has like $2,000 in his house. And so they're trying to get this money. But it ends up the Miller starts fighting back, and Lisi starts fighting back. And so they end up killing Miller and Lisi. Like, it's brutal. They kill him, or they kill Miller, and then they mortally wound Lisi. But he ends up surviving just barely, but his wounds eventually kill him. but one of them ends up leaving his cap there. William Hodges leaves his cap there, and they run back and they go back to Nauvoo. So the people in the area are infuriated. They're like, this is, because robbery is one thing. Murder, like, that's a whole different story. And that was one thing that a lot of the thieves at the time knew. Like, you can threaten people, you can do all you want, but you do not kill people, because people, the citizens wouldn't stand for it. So there's this massive manhunt. There's this $500 reward, which gets put up by the people to find these murderers. And that's a lot of money back then. So by this point, Edward Bonney and Dr. Williams and some other people are living in Iowa, and Edward Bonney starts getting this idea of, like, I can work with some other people. We can get that $500 reward, because he already has a pretty good idea of who did it. And so in his book, he basically takes all of the credit himself. He's like, like when he sees the fur cap, he's like, I saw a guy in Nauvoo who was wearing that cap. And so that's what he tells the sheriff. And, he's trying, so he totally, talks about how he's the hero. He's the guy. So he tells the sheriff who it is. And it's all because of him. They're able to capture the guys in Nauvoo. It was unusual because the Mormons did allow the people from Iowa to come into Nauvoo to take them. But there was kind of a standoff. And of course, Bonney's the one, he claims, that he was able to kind of calm everything down. And the Mormons actually do allow these two brothers to get taken from Nauvoo, to go back to get prosecuted for this murder. The third guy, Tom Brown, he ends up escaping. He leaves. He's smart enough to leave. What's interesting, though, is in Bonney's rough draft of his expose, the church on microfilm has a copy of his handwritten rough draft that was deposited by his, I believe it was a granddaughter, in the University of Illinois. He mentions that he had actually worked quite a bit with this guy, Peter Munjar, who was the brother-in-law of Dr. Williams. And Dr. Williams, around this time, gets whittled out of Nauvoo because he was showing too much effort to find the murders of Miller and Lacey. So it seems like Bonney probably was working with Dr. Williams and Dr. Williams' brother-in-law, Peter Munjar, in order to catch these guys, probably so they could get the $500, right? And so they're totally going after, but then that means they're kind of betraying the criminal gangs, right, that they used to be a part of. Eventually, the Hodges brothers end up, they have to change the venue because, of course, there's way too much animosity in Lee County. But they end up getting convicted of the murder, and they end up getting hung. And so there's some people who are really mad at Bonney about this, that Bonney would turn on people. But Bonney was like, hey, I got, $500 out of this. He's like, apparently turning to the other side can pay really well. But you had the people, it's actually really cool because Bonney, in his book, he actually gets these lists of all of the people who were trying to be witnesses on behalf of the Hodges, to try to claim that, like, no, they were in Nauvoo at the time. And so you actually get this, like, really neat list of both Mormons and non-Mormons who were part of the criminal gang because they all were trying to, like, testify with each other. And then Bonney was...
this is just convoluted.
It is very convoluted, which is why I don't tend to go into it with people, because it took a couple years just to kind of straighten everything out. Bonney... So, of course, the Munjar brothers do testify against the Hodges because they were probably working with Bonney. Dr. Williams refuses to testify against him, probably because he had gotten whittled out. He probably was a little more worried about his safety if he publicly testified against the Hodges. Bonney was on the schedule to testify. He ended up not testifying, but the Hodges get convicted and they are hung. to the end, both of the Hodges, the day before they're hung, one of the Hodges brothers comes to one of the lawyers and is like, okay, I'll confess everything and I'll tell you who's all there and who was all involved, who the criminal gang. He's like, I'll tell everything. And then the next morning he's like, I can't do it. It's going to put my family in danger if I do that. And so towards the end, when the two brothers get hung up in Burlington, Iowa, they're protesting their innocence all the way to the end. And just before they're hung, they claim that they're only getting hung because they're Mormons, because they're being persecuted because of their religion. But even the church leaders in Nauvoo knew that these guys were guilty of this murder. But it's interesting because they actually published in the Nauvoo newspaper that these men were not Mormons. They start to try to distance themselves from them and say, no, they weren't Mormons. They were. But there's a couple interesting things that also happen around the same time. When Brigham Young refuses to save these guys, to send in people to save these two guys, one of their brothers is furious about it. And so he actually threatens to expose all of the crime going on in the city, and he threatens Brigham Young's life. And the next night, he's dead. He is dead, he shows up dead. He was stabbed with his own knife multiple times. Ribs were broken, and it happened at night. He was on his way, it seemed, to Brigham Young's house. And there's policemen at Brigham Young's house, and so there's this huge, he's found by the policemen who are guarding Brigham Young's house. And people are asking him, who did this to you? Because he's still kind of alive. He refuses to name who does it to him, who killed him, according to the policeman. He just says, a friend from the river, someone who I thought was a friend. And so, of course, there's this huge thing where people are like, oh, it was totally the Mormon policeman who killed him because he was threatening the life of Brigham Young. And so there's people like, I think Mike Quinn and some others are convinced it was Hosea Stout, who was the chief of police, who totally had him killed. Because in his journal that night, he mentions he went to bed early and got up when people came in to tell him that this guy, Irvin Hodges, had been killed. And some people are like, really? He went to bed early that night? It's more likely that there were other Mormon criminals who were probably the ones who killed him in order to not have him reveal the depth of all the criminal gang activity. One of the non-Mormon criminals eventually names this Mormon criminal who did it. He says that this guy, Return Jackson Redden, was the one who killed Irvin Hodges. And he is a good candidate because he was a Mormon, he was trusted by Mormon leaders, and he was absolutely a criminal as well, part of the criminal gang activity. So you have that. You have another brother, Amos Hodges, who goes missing in July, that same summer, and people suspect that he was also killed. So you have all of these murders happening, right, around Nauvoo, and these are Mormon guys getting killed. Then, so they're hung mid-July.
This is 1845?
1845. So the murders, the Miller-Lisi murders are committed mid-May because the son-in-law, Henry Lisi, had survived the murder. He was able to positively identify the killers, which is why the Hodges brothers eventually get convicted. And then he dies shortly afterwards. But something else is happening. So a couple of the guys who had signed up to be witnesses for the Hodges end up committing a major murder also in July, shortly before the Hodges are killed, are hung over in Burlington.
Who knew there was all this? I mean, this is Wild West stuff here, right?
It is, absolutely, because that was the frontier at the time.
Yeah.
And that's something that's important to remember is that, it was really hard to convict criminals when they would have all these friends who would come and be witnesses for them. And so a lot of times people would get really frustrated over these criminal gangs, and that's why you had these eventually vigilante groups who would come in and drive out these gangs or hang the people or shoot the people, to try to clean up their community. And if you understand that a lot of the surrounding community viewed Mormons as this massive criminal gang. You can start to understand why you had these vigilante activities going on, and they were targeting Mormons. They were trying to warn them out. They were trying to like burn their houses so they would leave because they were trying to clean up their community. They saw Mormons as criminals. And the only way they could live in peace would be to get them out of the area. They could not live in peace with them because they were criminals.
Gaviant robbers.
Basically, yeah. And there were criminals who were based in Nauvoo. A couple of these were these non-Mormon criminals who were on that list of witnesses, who were witnesses for the Hodges brothers. Several of them get this plan. They're going to shake down this guy named Colonel Davenport up in Davenport, Iowa. He actually lived on the island right next to Davenport, Iowa, but they literally named the city after him. But he lived up in Rock Island, and he was this really well-respected, this old citizen, and supposedly someone had found out that he had all this money. Like, they thought it was $12,000, $13,000 that he had in his house. Like, this was, the hall of all halls. Like, they would be able to be done, doing any criminal activity if they got this hall. One of the guys was a little doubtful, but they end up going to this house of the Redden family who lived across the river from Nauvoo. And they plan they plan some stuff in Nauvoo, but they are also at this house of the Reddens, and they end up leaving. It's three guys, Robert Birch, William Fox, who's called Judge Fox, and this guy, John Long. And both John Long and I think it was Birch and Fox, actually, they were all involved in the trying to help the Hodges brothers. Birch had actually gone with a couple of other criminals they had actually mortgaged their property in order to pay for the lawyers for the Hodges brothers. So these guys were all very clearly intertwined. So these guys go up to Davenport, Iowa, which is about 100 miles north of Nauvoo. And they end up going in, and again, it's another botched robbery. The old guy's in his house alone. It's the 4th of July. There's a 4th of July picnic. All of his family leaves, so he's in the house. It's the perfect opportunity to come in, shake him down, and get all the money and leave. They go in, but almost immediately he starts trying to fight back, and so one of them shoots him in the leg. And they don't think, I don't believe that they think that it's a mortal wound. But they shoot him in the leg, and they're trying to get him to reveal his safe. They make him open up his safe, and there's only $600 in there. And they're like, where's all the rest of the money? And so, they're basically torturing him in a way. One of the guys I was just trying to give him water. But the way Davenport ends up surviving for a few hours afterwards, and he's was talking about how they were pouring water in his face and trying to wake him up. And so he saw it as they were torturing him. And so he tries to actually point towards, he has apparently the secret drawer in a dresser, but they don't ever find the secret drawer. So they think he's just tricking them, and they get more mad, and they're just so frustrated. And then they end up looking out his window, and they're like, man, so they're able to get a watch, but it's only $600. It's not worth the effort that they put into this. And so they're frustrated, and they end up looking out over the river, and there's this, they see some people in rafts in the river, and they get kind of scared. And so the burglars end up leaving and running away before and so he's still kind of conscious, and so he starts yelling out for help. This Davenport, what?
He bleeds out, basically?
He ends up, dying basically from loss of blood and shock. But so the crime happened around 2 p.m. in the afternoon. He ends up dying about 9 p.m. that night. But before he dies, he's able to shout for help. People come in. And he's able to give a really accurate description of the 3 guys that came in. So, I mean, they're able to write up very detailed descriptions of these three guys. And then he ends up, of course, passing away. He was like a beloved member of the community. Like, for Utah, it would be like Larry H. Miller, someone who had gone in and brutally murdered Larry H. Miller. Like, the community just gathers around. And the family, because the family's fairly wealthy, they end up putting up a $1,500 reward almost immediately. And they try all the leads, but they end up just, they can't find anything. And so they're putting out this $1,500 reward. And so I think it's about a couple weeks later. So now the Hodges brothers have died. Bonney's down in Lee County, Iowa, and they get this, and he's hanging out with the sheriff down there who he worked with in order to get the Hodges brothers, right? And so he's with the sheriff when they end up seeing this newspaper bill talking about this $1,500 reward. And it has this description of these three guys. And Bonney's like, I know who those guys are because they were criminals in Nauvoo. And he had probably worked with them. There's other evidence for that, but he's like, hey, sheriff, I actually know who these guys are. Can you write me a letter of recommendation up to the family? And so the sheriff writes him a letter of recommendation to the family saying, this guy totally helped us with down here finding the murders of these Miller Lisi. And he seems to know who these guys are that killed Davenport. So he might be able to help you
Nobody's suspicious that he knows all these murderers.
That's why he writes the expose later. And so he's developing this reputation as a bounty hunter, essentially, right? So he goes up to Davenport, Iowa, and Rock Island, really, Illinois, but he goes up and he's with the family and he's explaining to them, he's like, look, the three guys you're looking for are this guy named John Long, this guy named William Fox, and this guy named, his real name was Robert Birch, but he went by Robert Bleecker in Nauvoo. And he's like, I know these three guys are your guys, and so they're like, okay, so how do we find them? And how do we get them? And so eventually, Bonney, and in his expose, he's like, I felt so bad for them, and I knew I was one of the few people that had the skills that could probably get them. And he's like, so I just, out of the goodness of my heart, I decided to help the family.
It wasn't that $1,500
It wasn't
reward.
the $1,500. But he decides to go undercover in order to find these guys. Again, same thing as Joseph H. Jackson. It's a total get out of jail free card, right? Because he's like, I'm going to participate in this criminal activity in order to get these really bad guys. So, I'm going to have to do things that look like they're illegal. But he ends up being very careful. He's very careful when he goes to these different places because remember, he actually does have a criminal record and he is wanted in certain places. So he's very careful about checking in with the sheriffs of all the different places that he's going in to have this. So he decides to go undercover. Before he goes undercover, he makes the family promise that if anything happens to him, they'll take care of his wife and his kids. And so, he's got it handled. So if he dies, at least his wife and kids are taken care of. And so he ends up, and this is what his book talks about, is he goes undercover, he goes back, he permeates the community, and he talks about and of course I didn't know all of this before, how to do these signs. So he talks about I talked to this other guy and he told me about all of these criminals I could start contacting in order to figure out where these guys had gone. And of course, he's always learning all of these criminal things from other people. It's not like he already knows how to find the local criminals in the different areas. And so it's a really fascinating story. And eventually, it is really cool. It is, a great true crime. It'd be a great movie. It's fascinating. But eventually he's able to, through his efforts, coordinating, he travels, he's in Iowa, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, and he has to go into Ohio, and he gets a little nervous when he goes into Ohio. And it becomes obvious, if he has this background where he's wanted in Ohio, it makes sense. But he's eventually able to help facilitate the arrest of 8 guys. So you have the 3 guys who actually were in the house, who were shaking down Colonel Davenport. But then you have like the guy who was kind of the lookout. You have the guy you have all of these accessories who were aware of this thing, who either helped them afterwards or helped them before. And so he's able to arrange the arrest of 8 guys. One of them, William Fox, he ends up escaping custody, but these other guys he's all able to bring in. And remember, the community is furious, and so they're bringing in, and so he helps orchestrate all of these arrests at the same time in all of these different areas, so that like there's no, so that people aren't given a heads up. It's actually a really fascinating story that has so many details to it. But he gets them all back in Rock Island. The court ends up prosecuting 3 guys. A couple of the guys are able to get continuances so that their trials will happen at the next term. One of the guys turned state's evidence, and so he's not on trial at that point, but he, is able to talk about what happened and in order to lighten his own sentence. So the 3 guys that end up being put on trial, one of them is John Long, where he was actually one of the 3 guys that was there when Davenport was robbed. And then there's his brother, Aaron Long, who had gone up with them, but he was at the base camp, and so he was kind of holding down the fort when the 3 guys went in and robbed Davenport, but he was considered an accessory. And then the 3rd guy was a guy named Granville Young, who was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had intercepted the 3 guys on their way up to Davenport, and he had heard about their plan, and he's like, oh, that's a really cool plan, like $13,000, that's amazing. And so he's like, can I buy in on it? And so he had, he's like, so I'm going to go sell these 2 stolen horses that I have, and then I'll put that money towards it, and then that way I can get a share of the stuff. So he was aware of it ahead of time, and that's how the lawyers end up prosecuting him, as he was aware of it. He was an accessory, and he didn't try to stop them, so therefore he should be punished as well. Of course, the community is furious. They want justice, immediate justice. And so these 3 guys, even though only one of them was there at the time that they were murdered, there's this massive trial. And of course, John Long and Aaron Long were both based in Nauvoo. Granville Young was a frequent visitor of Nauvoo. Like, they were all part of that Nauvoo criminal gang. And the 3 guys end up getting convicted and hung. And they're sentenced to be hung. They end up getting hung. But before they're hung, the criminal people, there's a lot of people mad at Edward Bonney now, because Edward Bonney now has he's like this massive hero in the community. His name is plastered all over the newspapers as this incredible bounty hunter, this wonderful man who brought Davenport's killers to justice. And you have the criminal gangs down in Nauvoo are ticked. They are so mad at him. Also because, you have these guys, Aaron Long and Granville Young. John Long and the other 2, they're 19, 20, in the early 20s. So they're fairly young kids. You have a lot of the older guys who are kind of mad that these young kids are getting killed because Edward Bonney turned them in, basically. And so you start getting this conspiracy. This guy down in Iowa named Silas Haight, he ends up working, and he has this plan to get these 3 guys at least, if not off, at least, maybe he can get their sentences at least lessened or something. And so his plan is to have the 3 of them turn state's evidence against Edward Bonney. He wants to have Bonney convicted because he knows, because he was associated with the criminal gang. Silas Haight knows that Edward Bonney was a counterfeiter. He knows he was part of all the criminal activity. And so he orchestrates this plan where he's going to get Bonney indicted in Iowa for murder, for helping out on the Miller-Lacey murders with the Hodges, for counterfeiting, and for basically 3 counts of counterfeiting, having presses and then passing counterfeit money. And so he goes and he's able to get Dr. Williams to testify against Bonney. And it's likely he set up Dr. Williams to also get caught, which is probably why Dr. Williams agreed to testify against Edward Bonney. Just because of some other reason. Again, this is, like you said, it's very convoluted.
Right.
And it is hard to piece all of this stuff together. But he's able to get these indictments. But at the same time, because they really need a trial to happen. They need a trial to happen to get an opportunity for these 3 guys who are about to be killed. They are 2 weeks away from getting hung. They need a trial to happen so these 3 guys can testify against Bonney, because then that'll pause.
To save their own heads.
That will save their lives. And so he is like, Silas Haight books it back down to Lee County, Iowa, because the term is almost over. The court term is almost over. And so he's able to get, probably arranges for Dr. Williams to get caught. But then that way Dr. Williams will testify against Edward Bonney. He gets Bill Hickman and some of the other gang from
Wild
Nauvoo. Wild Bill Hickman, who was also part of the criminal gangs. He gets him to testify against Edward Bonney. That's how they get the murder charge on him. He, at the same time, you also have Dr. Williams testify that a bunch of church leaders were counterfeiting as well. And I suspect part of that was to try to guarantee a trial would take place. Because at the time there was so much anti-Mormon sentiment. This was October 1845. The church leaders had already agreed by this point that they would be leaving in the spring. And there's all this other stuff happening in Hancock County. So, but again, these guys really needed a trial to happen to get these 3 kids basically off the hook, or delayed, at least the hanging delayed, so that they could bring them in. And so what Silas Haight does is he gets the indictments in Lee County. He goes to the governor of Iowa, and the governor of Iowa agrees that, those 3 guys could be useful in the cases against Bonney. And so he sends the extradition request to the governor of Illinois, because these guys, because Davenport lived in Rock Island, Illinois, they're getting killed there. But Silas Haight was not able to convince the Illinois governor that these guys needed to be arrested. So the plan had been that on the day that they were going to get hung, Silas Haight was going to come in with a bunch of people from, like, a bunch of police, and they were going to very publicly arrest Edward Bonney at this hanging of these 3 guys. And then the hanging of the 3 guys would be delayed, and so it was going to be this huge thing where you're going to have these 3 guys in front of this crowd that's like all paying attention. They're on their last words. They're going to have all of these crimes against Edward Bonney. They're going to tell all of these, how Bonney is such a horrible person. And then, they're going to have the crowd all just like, oh my gosh. And then they're going to march in and arrest Edward Bonney. And then the hanging would be stopped. That was the plan. That was the big dramatic plan. But the Illinois governor doesn't go along with it. Probably because he knew, people in Rock Island, they wanted justice. They wanted swift justice. And so he does not agree to allow the Iowa governor to have these guys extradited. But they do still, on the stand, they're kind of delaying, probably because they're still hoping that these police officers will come. Edward Bonney figures out that something's up. He gets warned by Lyman E. Johnson. Lyman E. Johnson is part of this whole thing. He's an attorney, but he had family connections to a lot of the criminals.
He was an apostle, right?
He had been an apostle, yeah. He had left the church, though. Or he'd been excommunicated back in Missouri. So, it's so convoluted. So, on the stand, when these guys are getting killed, or just before they're hung, October 29th, they start talking about how Bonney is this horrible, horrible person, and how he's a counterfeiter, how he was the one who alerted people to the Hodges, that the Millers had this money he was the one that like had given the idea to the Hodges to go like shake down the Millers. And so, you know, and all of the claims they have on when they're on the scaffold about to get hung, like match up perfectly with all of the indictments that had been given against Edward Bonney the week prior. So it was clear that there was communication happening where they were listing out exactly all of the crimes he had done, which corresponded perfectly with the indictments that Silas Haight had against them on October 26th. So that's why it's pretty clear that there was a coordinated effort in order to try to get Bonney. But while they're on the scaffold, John Long, he's like totally upfront. He's like, look, I'm a criminal. I was there. I've done enough crimes. Whatever. Hang me. That's fine. He's like, but my brother, Aaron Long, and Granville Young, he's like, they do not deserve to be up here. And so he's the one that goes off on Bonney and just like listing everything. And he gives the names of several people in Nauvoo who can vouch that Bonney was a counterfeiter. They know that John Long had helped hide Bonney's presses when the governor's troops were coming in. And so among the names that he lists are, you have a couple guys, Reuben Loomis, you have a guy named Joseph McCall, and they don't end up playing big parts later, but Dr. Williams is one of those that he names as a witness, which Dr. Williams had already said that he could testify. And then he also names a guy named Carlos Jove, who is a non-Mormon who lived in Nauvoo. He married Flora Woodworth, who was one of Joseph Smith's plural wives. And there's a whole story there too. But then the last guy he names is Theodore Turley.
I was just going to say, I'm like, I know this has to tie into Theodore Turley somehow.
So October 29th, on the scaffold, John Long names Theodore Turley as one of the people that can testify against Bonney, that knows that Bonney was a criminal. And he doesn't say that Theodore Turley himself was the one, but just that Theodore Turley was aware of stuff that had happened. And again, it corresponds because the week prior, remember I had said Carlos Jove was married to Flora Woodworth. The week prior, before all the indictments are coming through in Lee County, the day before, a bunch of people from Iowa come in and to Nauvoo and actually search Lucian Woodworth's house for counterfeiting press. And they question his daughter specifically, who was Flora Woodworth. So clearly Carlos Jove was getting targeted at that time too. Silas Haight was probably trying to get him caught so he could help testify against Bonney too in Lee County. At the time, they mentioned that they got that information because another criminal had been arrested for counterfeiting in Lee County, and of course the next day Dr. Williams, the one that is suddenly having to answer for his own counterfeiting charges. So Dr. Williams and Carlos Jove were both targeted, and they both end up getting named the next week as people that can corroborate these charges against Edward Bonney. So that's in October. So you have these Lee County, Iowa indictments against church leaders plus Edward Bonney. November. Silas Haight, mid-November, Silas Haight, Dr. Williams, and then a guy named David Bates Smith, who was another participant of the Nauvoo criminal gang. He lived in Alton, Illinois by that point. They end up intercepting Theodore Turley. He's on his way. He's traveling up or down the river. I don't know if he was on his way to Nauvoo. He was the armorer general of the Nauvoo Legion. So at this time, this is 1845, he's trying to procure a lot of arms. And so I know a lot of weapons. And so earlier he had gone down to New Orleans to purchase a bunch of weapons. He was probably either on his way down or on his way back. But they board the steamer at Alton, Illinois, and they have the local constable arrest Theodore Turley. And so they go back, and there's a local church member at the time who writes a letter. And so he's like, this guy who says he's this agent of the government, which matches Silas Haight, this guy named Dr. Williams from Montrose, Iowa, and then this other guy named Smith, who's this engineer, and which is David Bates Smith. And they're claiming that they saw counterfeiting equipment in Theodore Turley's shop. So they end up having him arrested, and he goes up to Springfield, Illinois, and he stays in jail for about a month. But again, this is one of those guys who can testify against Edward Bonney, supposedly, right? So in Iowa, so after the indictments are given in Iowa, Silas Haight takes the writs. This is, back at the end of October. He takes the writs the same day that they're given because it's the last day of the term, and so of the court term. And so he brings them over. He hand delivers them to Carthage, Illinois, to Major Warren, who is head of the governor's troops in the area. And he's like, you need to go into Nauvoo and arrest these church leaders. Because again, he needs a trial to happen so that he could get these other guys off. And Major Warren's like, okay, he was already planning to go to Nauvoo. He was going to arrest Jack Redden for his role in as an accessory in the murder of Colonel George Davenport. Lyman E. Johnson had tried to help have Jack Redden arrested because they were related. Jack Redden's aunt had married Lyman Johnson's aunt had married Jack Redden's uncle. So they were kind of had this family connection. So Lyman E. Johnson had kind of tricked Jack Redden to coming out on the wharf earlier that day, and he had the sheriff of Rock Island there, and they were trying to arrest Jack Redden. But of course, this is October 1845. The Mormons on the wharf start freaking out because they don't want any Mormons arrested because they think this is a whole anti-Mormon thing. So they start throwing rocks. They start injuring the people. So they're protecting Jack Redden, who outsiders see as like one of the Davenport murderers. But they're trying to protect a Mormon from these non-Mormons who are coming in and trying to arrest him. So they end up going down. Warren, the Rock Island County sheriff, who had already been injured, had already gone down to Carthage and was like, I need your help arresting this guy for the murder of George Davenport. So Warren was already planning to go to Nauvoo to arrest Jack Redden. And then Silas Haight comes over and he is like, we need to arrest these church leaders and Edward Bonney and other people. And so Warren's like, okay. So he takes the warrants in, but he has no desire to arrest any of the church leaders because in his mind, and we hear about this later, he explains it later, in his mind, it doesn't matter if the church leaders are innocent or guilty. If they get sent to jail, it's going to delay the Mormons leaving Illinois in his mind. And he's like, my job is to make sure they leave. He's like, so I am not doing anything that's going to possibly delay that. So he wants to come, and so he marches into Nauvoo with all of these soldiers. On the way in, he ends up seeing Hosea Stout with a bunch of armed men, and there had been already a rule that you weren't supposed to have large numbers of men because there had already been a lot of armed conflicts. So he's furious by the time he comes into Nauvoo, marches up to church leaders. Why are there armed men on the road? I'm trying to keep the peace here. You guys are not helping me. And, we have a warrant in here. We need to arrest someone. And he's referring to Jack Redden, but church leaders think that they're trying to arrest them back on treason charges that had happened earlier. So John Taylor starts going off on about, we're not going to allow you to arrest people. He's like, of course, because he's like, I know what it's like to be in police custody, supposedly safe, when he's like, I still have the bullets from when the law was supposedly trying to protect us. He's like, stupid law. So John Taylor goes off on Warren. And so Warren is just sitting there. And keep in mind, he has arrest warrants for John Taylor and Brigham Young on counterfeiting charges. He could have totally just flat out right there just arrested him. But he was a smart guy. And even though he was furious, he just turns around and he leaves. And he's like, not doing anything. I'm just leaving here. We're going to diffuse the situation. And so he starts considering declaring martial law in Hancock County. And so the Mormons start to become very worried about that. And so these two guys, I think it's Orson Hyde and I can't remember who the other is, they write this letter to the governor, kind of giving their side, and John Taylor gave some spirited, but like not unjustified remarks about, but like we're trying to work,
trying to
and
get out of here.
please don't have Warren, like do martial law and all this stuff. And then, so that's on Sunday they write the letter. It was Saturday when they had marched in. And then on Tuesday, there's this secret meeting that occurs where Warren comes in with a bunch of the judges. They meet with church leaders, and so Warren is like, why wouldn't you guys allow me to arrest Jack Redden? And they're like, what? You were coming in to arrest Redden? Like, they had no clue. They thought they were just doing another, in their minds, anti-Mormon thing, coming in, just trying to be difficult. And he's like, you're like gonna just stop us from arresting murderers? And they're like, no, that would have been fine. And so it really was like this massive misunderstanding. And so eventually they're able to kind of quietly no, we're totally fine if you arrest him, but I'm pretty sure he's left town by now. And so that's when Warren explains his side of the story, where he's like, I totally had writs that I was not planning to issue, but man, it was tempting. So anyway, we have the minutes from that meeting, and it's fascinating to just see all of this interplay, because it's all related to these stupid counterfeiting charges. And they know that it was Dr. Williams who testified against them. So then you have November, you have Theodore Turley getting arrested, because remember, he can testify against Bonney. And so he gets taken to Springfield. It's clear that Warren is not going to allow these Iowa writs to be enforced. He's not going to do it. So they need to figure out another way to get a trial, because now Dr. Williams is on counterfeiting charges. He needs to be able to testify against someone so he can get off on his charges. Silas Haight is still trying to punish Bonney, because they're still mad at Bonney for doing what he did. And so what they end up doing is they keep stalling, and they keep Theodore Turley in jail in Springfield. And they're trying to get him out, because they're like, there's no real good solid evidence, and he should be able to at least get off on bail. But apparently it was like a crazy amount of bail, and so they eventually were able to get the bail dropped, but not before the beginning of the U.S. district or federal court that met in Springfield. So before, you had Hancock County Court, you had Lee County. Now we're doing federal district court in Springfield. There was a term that was starting there. And so on the first day of the term, they get Dr. Williams, they get some other guys, they get Silas Haight, and they list these 12 guys in Nauvoo on counterfeiting, which includes a whole bunch of church leaders. It includes Theodore Turley. It includes Joseph H. Jackson, Eaton, Barton, they'd already been outed as counterfeiters. So everyone already knew that at least some of these guys were counterfeiters. Peter Hawes is on the list. And of course, Edward Bonney's on the list, right? So they need a trial to happen. So before Theodore Turley is released from jail, they make sure these indictments are done. So he's released on a $250 bond. But now you have U.S. Marshals now going after church leaders on these counterfeiting charges. So now the Illinois governor can kind of say, it's not me going after you. And the marshals actually go to the governor and say, can we get your help arresting these people? And the governor's like, nope, you may not have our help. I am not helping you guys. We have already had our issues with these people. But the U.S. Marshals do go into Nauvoo, and with Silas Haight, they're hunting down the church leaders, constantly trying to arrest them, because they don't really care as much about Bonney. They don't care as much about Joseph Jackson. They want to get to the big guys. They want to arrest Brigham Young. They want to arrest the church leaders. So that's who they're targeting. So they hang out outside the temple, and so the church leaders are constantly in hiding, having to be in hiding because of these stupid counterfeiting indictments, because Silas Haight and Dr. Williams are trying to punish Bonney. But they're bringing in these church leaders because that pretty much guarantees a trial is going to happen. And so then they can bring in all this stuff. Yeah, it's so convoluted. And I'm sure I've lost like a bunch of people already. But this is where you get the story of the bogus Brigham incident. And so it's playing off the idea that counterfeit coin is called bogus. But then you had Brigham Young, and he was so proud of this. The church leaders were so proud of this. You had Brigham Young, who was hiding in the temple, and he had the U.S. Marshals outside. And I want to say this was last week in December. You have the U.S. Marshals hanging out outside, and they're watching, they're waiting for Brigham Young to come out. And what they end up doing is they have William Miller come out in Brigham Young's coat and his hat. And then they have someone else like mention Brigham's name. And so it perks up the U.S. Marshals, and they're like, oh, that must be Brigham Young. And so they go and they arrest the guy, and they go and they take him to jail to another city. A guy there at the jail is like, you guys are idiots. This is not Brigham Young. And oh my gosh, even the Warsaw Signal said this was a good joke. This was a good prank. Like, okay, Mormons did good on this. And so they call it the bogus Brigham incident, but church leaders were so proud of themselves on that one that they got another guy arrested because they tricked the U.S. Marshals into thinking it was Brigham Young. So that's the bogus Brigham incident, because it was about counterfeiting charges and it was a bogus Brigham. But about the same time, you have the Illinois governor starts realizing that maybe he can use this to his advantage. And so he sends a letter to Jacob Backenstoss, who's the sheriff of Hancock County. And he heavily implies that the federal government may be sending in U.S. troops to enforce these federal writs. And he has no control over what the federal government's going to do. And so he purposely starts playing up this risk that federal troops any day are going to be marching into Nauvoo. And it spooks the leaders enough, because of enough other things that are going on, that they start moving up the timeline for leaving. And their first priority is to get everyone who has arrest warrants out for them need to leave first. They and their families need to get out of town first. But that's why they end up having to leave at such a horrible time. And the governor admitted later he wrote a history of Illinois, and he totally admits he overplayed the risk of the federal troops coming in, but he's like, wanted them out. So it's funny because you actually had Major Warren initially who didn't want to enforce the arrest warrants because he was worried it would delay them leaving. But then later on you have the Illinois governor who's like, okay, like we can use this to our advantage. We can do this. So historically, a lot of historians have thought that the counterfeiting charges that were done in both Iowa and in Springfield at the federal level were a ploy by government officials to get the saints out of Illinois sooner. And so that was my argument for the Mormon History Association presentation, was that no, the counterfeiting accusations are actually this ploy by these other criminals to try to get back at Bonney, try to get a trial, trying to save these three guys initially, but now trying to get these other guys off the hook because now they have counterfeiting charges against them. So it was not the governor who initially did the counterfeiting charges. It had very little to do with that, but the governor used it. He did use it later on. Mm-hmm. Most of the Mormons, so the only person of the 12 men who were indicted who eventually does go to trial. Most of the Mormons, obviously they leave, they go west. Silas Haight and Edward Bonney still go after Theodore Turley. There's evidence that they're still trying to catch him before the Iowa court. They're trying, because again, he can testify against Bonney, right? And Bonney wants to get to him before he can testify against him. But eventually, Bonney is put on trial. And this is where you have Dr. Williams and Silas Haight testify against him, and they have some other guys testify against him. And this is where you have guys from the Hancock County grand jury who come in and say, yeah, Dr. Williams testified to us, and he gave no indication that Edward Bonney was involved. He gave no indication. So eventually, Edward Bonney gets off the hook more because Dr. Williams and Silas Haight, they're able to prove that they're not super trustworthy witnesses, that it's clear that they had a motive, that they were trying to go after Bonney, they were trying to get Bonney convicted. But it's interesting because the court reporters at the time are like, wow, Bonney does not look good coming from this testimony, but it is clear that there was some conspiracy and coordination against him. So 10 of the jurors actually signed this letter telling the U.S. Treasury that they need to fire Silas Haight as a contractor agent to locate counterfeiters and arrest counterfeiters. That Dr. Williams is just like this horrible person, and that, just kind of exposing this entire scheme, this entire conspiracy, which is why we know about it. And so of course, so Bonney ends up, off. So he's able to say, obviously that meant I was innocent.
Right.
And other people are like, not really. And then what's really fascinating is that about a month or two after the trial ends, because it gets delayed and there's problems with witnesses, so the trial doesn't end up happening until the end of 1846. Sorry, the end of 1847, sorry. Or was it 48? Now I'm messing it up. But it takes a couple years for the trial to actually be completed. But then about a month or two after the trial is completed, in a completely different counterfeiting bust over in Illinois, there is this letter discovered among the effects. When they're going through, they're finding all the evidence. And there's this letter from Edward Bonney to this criminal talking about how he's setting up his own merchandising outlet in Montrose, Iowa. It's dated from when he moved to Montrose, Iowa, talking about how he's excited to, it's using all of the euphemisms, but basically he was excited to start helping with the horse theft ring and all of these things. Basically makes him look like a criminal. But it comes out after he's already been, declared not guilty on the counterfeiting charges. But it's very clear he was very organized with it. So he ends up developing a pretty bad reputation. So this is beginning of 47. So then he starts writing his version of the story. And so that's where we start getting where he's handwriting, and we get these rough drafts. And it's interesting because in the rough draft, the initial one, he talks a lot more about Nauvoo, talks a lot more about his close relationship with Joseph Smith. He talks a lot more about how Joseph Smith trusted him so much, about how, of course he wasn't wild about the Mormons, and he's trying to kind of distance himself a little bit. But by the time you get to the final version, he barely even talks about Nauvoo. He's just talking about I've been there.
It's too problematic.
It's too problematic. He can't spin it a good way. And so, but he does talk about how criminals would come to Nauvoo in order to avoid being arrested. He describes the criminal gang networks, the way they had the way stations, the way that they would steal horses. He goes into detail in how the criminal gangs worked, and so, which makes it fascinating. But yeah, he definitely plays up that he is the hero, and he was just trying to figure out what crimes other people were doing. And of course, he had nothing to do with them. And as proof at the end, he prints out this statement that the jurors had written talking about how Silas Haight and Dr. Williams were just these awful, awful people that were just having all of these false charges. And so, it's trying to figure out all of this stuff has been crazy, but it's also, it's fascinating, just all the different threads coming around. So. And
you're writing a book on this?
I'll eventually have to, just because it's too convoluted not to.
Yeah. Because I know you talked to a couple of publishers at.
Oh. Yeah, crime is just kind of a fun topic, and right. So yeah, there were a couple of publishers that came up and said, if you want to do a book on it, we'll take it. But I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, the exposés, like, a lot of times people will just dismiss the exposés because it's like it's anti-Mormon stuff. But there is such cool, fascinating information in there. It's difficult to parse out when, like, when they're telling the truth, when they're not, when they're just kind of stretching the truth a little bit.
Because they all have motives.
Exactly. So they definitely have some motives. Like Joseph H. Jackson, I had mentioned, he had tried to court Hiram Smith's daughter. So Hiram Smith looks really bad in Joseph H. Jackson's little expose. He really goes after Hiram, which, if you know Hiram's like reputation as a total stick in the mud, like that's one of the big red flags in Joseph H. Jackson's. Like, you can accuse Joseph Smith of some shenanigans, but when you start accusing Hiram Smith, you're like, that starts to look a little weird. But it's interesting. I mean, there's several people. You have like John C. Bennett, who kind of goes into a little bit of the crimes in his 1842 expose. But he's mainly quoting court records and newspapers, so you can kind of confirm his stuff. Joseph H. Jackson's expose is amazing. Edward Bonney's expose is fascinating, but it's fascinating to compare the rough drafts with the final one.
It's weird that we have rough drafts, because you wouldn't normally have those, right?
You wouldn't normally have them. And so...
How do we have them?
What?
How do we have the rough draft?
Okay, so they were deposited by, I think it was his granddaughter, in, I don't know if it's University of Illinois.
Wow.
In a university repository out there. And then the church history library has a copy of the microfilm. And so the church history library, so that's where I was able to access it, is they have a microfilm of the rough drafts. And the only reason I knew that there were rough drafts available is in, like just doing the research and doing different articles, because obviously people have looked into Edward Bonney because he's just a fascinating character. Someone had mentioned these rough drafts that were at this place. And so I was like, well, that's cool. Like, is there any way I could access them through contacting the special collections? So then when I found out the church history library had it, I was like, okay, well, I have to go down there and I have to look at it. And it's really cool because a lot of what's in his book, he doesn't necessarily list his sources, but he'll talk about how he's receiving letters all the time. He'll talk about this, he'll talk about that. In the rough draft, he actually quotes the letters. He gives the dates, he gives the name, he gives it from. And so it's really cool. You can actually see where this information is coming from. And you can see the dates. And so you can see, oh, this is how he knew. So this is how I can prove that the indictments were from this court term, were coming from this date, because Lyman E. Johnson wrote him a letter warning him that he had these indictments in Lee County, Iowa. And so it's really fascinating. The rough drafts are actually really helpful in kind of pinning down some neat details that we can corroborate. So, but that's the thing, is finding the details to corroborate. Going through the exposés, going through a lot of the newspapers are really good, because a lot of these court, because people love the true crime stuff, right? And so a lot of the times the reporters would write up exactly who was the witnesses, what they actually testified, and so that's where we get it. Like on the Hodges trial, the Bonney's trial, they're all from these newspapers that are reporting exactly what these people are saying. The Davenport trial was such a big deal that there was actually a pamphlet published that not only gave the details of the crime, but they also gave the court transcript, like a summarized version of the court transcript. And then they also had interviews. The reporter went and interviewed the 3 criminals before they were hung. And so we can actually get a little bit more of their background. Where did they come from? And then it goes into, it gives the confession from Robert Birch, which gives a few more inside details of the murder. And so that was really cool. That was a major find. I was able to, the only place I could find that had a copy of it was the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library.
Wow.
And so I was able to contact them and the special collections area. They were awesome. They were able to send me a PDF of it. And the lady that was helping me, she apologized profusely because it was actually just a photocopy of it. They didn't even have the original pamphlet, but it was the only place I could find that had a copy. And so she just apologized profusely. And so I'm sitting there and transcribing it. But I was able to find enough spots where it was it had been quoted in some other newspapers. And so I was able to kind of figure it out. So I basically wrote up a transcript of it. I'm like, okay, if anyone else is trying to research this, here's this, because I know enough other sources about this. I can figure this out a little bit easier than maybe someone else can.
I hope you all see what an amazing researcher she is.
But it was awesome. I have to give a huge shout out to Special Collections, both at BYU, obviously Church History Library. I've had people help out so much. BYU Special Collections scanned the full William Hall's expose, which talks about counterfeiting as well. And they totally scanned his entire expose.
For you,
they won it
basically?
For me.
Nice.
Yeah. I mean, like, you have to pay for the images, but
right.
I was like, you guys will seriously do that? I'll pay for it. But, like, because it's hard for me with my position, like, since I'm a stay-at-home mom, it's hard for me to go down there and
right.
actually, you know, like, sit there and research it in Special Collections, and they were awesome. So I have had such people, archivists are just awesome. They are so helpful. Anyway, so I want to give a shout out to that.
So when's your book coming out?
No, I want to get, so obviously I'm working on my portfolio to get certified as a genealogist.
Right.
Or become a certified genealogist to get credentialed.
So this is your side project.
Yeah. And then I also, one of my big things, because I am working on Theodore Turley, is there's not a lot of peer-reviewed stuff out there on him. And so a lot of the stuff, the only item that really is published that all the scholars quote is this 1978 compilation of family history information, which, you know, took 20 years to put together, but it's very outdated and it's wrong and it's incorrect in a lot of ways. So I do want to get an article out just on Theodore Turley, just kind of correcting the record and giving a good peer-reviewed source for scholars to use. That's why I was so excited at Sunstone when we were listening in Todd Compton's section.
Yeah.
And he was talking about, so for people know that Todd Compton came out with this book in Sacred Loneliness, which talked about all the different wives of Joseph Smith. He's now come out through Signature Books, this second book in Sacred Loneliness, The Documents,
right.
where he's actually printing a lot of these so that the women could kind of tell their full story in their own words, as opposed to him just piecing out different parts. But because so many of Joseph Smith's wives ended up marrying Brigham Young, so he has an appendix that has, you know, the list of all Joseph Smith's wives. He also has an appendix that has a list of all of Brigham Young's wives. And so Brigham Young ended up marrying one of my family members, a girl named Mary Ann Turley. And so he was in that appendix, and he and I are working on we're both contributors to this polygamy book that's coming out in the next year.
Didn't know about that.
I can talk about that one. But so he had contacted me because he was like, "Oh, you're a Turley person, and so, you know, you might be interested that I have this little blurb."
I think we need to change your title from stay-at-home mom.
I'm a nerd. Well, hopefully. But so he contacted me. He gave me this little biography, thinking it would be really cool. You know, like I'd be really interested in it. And I kind of took it. I was like, well, that's great. I'm so glad you showed this to me, because this is wrong, and this is wrong, and this is wrong, and this is wrong, and this is wrong. And so, like, like all these things. So I send him back the edits, and he's like, oh. He's like, I wonder if I can contact the publisher and have them change it before it goes in print. And I was like, oh, that's why I thought you were contacting me. I felt really bad. But he did. He was able to get all of the changes. Nice. And so...
so you're correcting Todd Compton?
Okay, I'm correct. There's not a lot of good stuff out there on the Turley family that's correct, that's been researched really well, right? So that was, like, huge to me. So he was able to get the corrections in there. And so that is, like... So, yeah, we're starting to correct the record. They have the right person in charge of
the Theodore Turley family.
Well, I'm in charge of the website, so I do a lot of the research. I was a past president, but it's fun. And for me to do the research, it's super fun. And trying to share, because we're still finding new things about them. The polygamy book. Okay. So this one's coming out from Signature Books. Cheryl Bruno, who used to do Wheat and Tares, she used to blog on Wheat and Tares. She's now one of the authors of the new Freemasonry book, Method Infinite. She is doing this book, and it's on early polygamy in Nauvoo, and most of the chapters, most of the essays, they're all from different people. You have big names like Todd Compton. She had sent out like a request basically saying, you know, like, we need a couple more people. And if you want to have, like, if you're publishing with some of these big names, you know, like, so that's how I went in. And I was like, well, I have this Theodore Turley information because he was one of the early polygamists in Nauvoo. And so that's why I decided to write an essay. I wanted to focus more on the 3 sisters that he married in Nauvoo, because the family had backdated one of his marriages, and so he was often noted in a lot of scholarly stuff. He was always like a footnote that, like, theoretically he had this super early plural marriage before anyone else besides Joseph Smith had a plural marriage, but like Gary Bergera and other people had already figured out that it was probably backdated because the girl had actually had an illegitimate child, and there was this huge high council case because this guy had told her that church leaders were practicing polygamy, and so, like, I mean, so there was this huge thing.
It wasn't John C. Bennett.
It was not John C. Bennett. But it was a few months after John C. Bennett was excommunicated for all of that stuff. Anyway, so historians had already figured out that this early marriage was probably backdated, that Theodore Turley was probably later.
To cover up for the child.
To cover up for the child, to basically legitimize the child for later family records. And so I knew Theodore Turley, like, he's often mentioned. This would be a great opportunity to kind of correct some information. But also these 3 sisters really had some fascinating stories. Like, and so there was, and again, so much more information out there that we had discovered that I really wanted to get their stories out there. And so one of the sisters, the whole reason I had gotten into researching her was because we, as an organization, we decided to give her a headstone we found out she was buried in the Salt Lake City Cemetery, but she didn't have a headstone. And it turned out there was another family member buried right next to her who also didn't have a headstone. And so I was like, I kind of took that on as my special project, like, when I first started coming into the organization. So then I suddenly had to research her, right? And so then that's when I started coming up with, like, digging into all this early polygamy, all of the deception, all of the stuff, and it was crazy. But that means that I always had kind of a soft spot for her. And so that was something I really thought was cool, was in this book about early polygamy, having this opportunity to kind of take the viewpoint of why would some of these women agree to participate? What was happening in their backgrounds that they may have seen this as a positive, that they would have seen more positive than negative coming out of agreeing to become one of these early plural wives. And so that was a big deal to me. So I'm excited for that chapter to come out, given the stories of those 3 women.
Yeah.
So
might have to have it back on.
But yeah, there's some interesting stuff. But yeah, the crime stuff, it is convoluted. It is very convoluted.
We're going to change it from stay-at-home mom to stay-at-home researcher.
Yep. Still the on-call parent.
I hope you guys understand what an amazing researcher is.
But it's really fun. Obviously I get really excited about it. And, but it's fascinating, and it's just, yeah.
Well, I love talking to nerds like you.
That's why we get along.
I know. I was talking to somebody last night, and I'm like, don't get me started. I'll talk your ear off.
Exactly.
So, all right. Well, anything else we should add before I let you go?
I think we've given people enough for right now. I think we're good.
All right. Well, everybody, give her lots of thumbs ups and tell her to write more on Wheat and Tear so we can find out more of this stuff. So.
I have talked a little bit about the Nauvoo Counterfeiting on Wheat and Tear.
Yeah.
I do have 3.
Oh, that's right. You've got 3 of those. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'll make sure I link to those.
So, yeah.
All right. Well, Mary Ann Clements, thank you for being on Gospel Tangents. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Mary Ann Clements. Mary Ann, thank you so much for sitting down with me. You're an amazing researcher, and love working with you at Wheat and Tears. In our next conversation, I'm going to go from a new-timer to an old-timer in Mormon history. Yes, we've got Newell Bringhurst back on the show. He's written a biography on the prophet Harold B. Lee. So one of the interesting things is I think he was ordained as a 10-year-old deacon. Is that
That's
sound right?
correct. Yeah, that's very unusual because I didn't realize that was even within legal or within church, canon, that they would allow somebody to be ordained as a 10-year-old deacon. And that was reflective of his precocity, that he was extremely bright. He stood out in terms of his intellect and his drive and just who he was.
If you like what we're doing here on Gospel Tangents, please become a paid subscriber at gospeltangents.com or patreon.com/gospeltangents. We've got full transcripts on our website at gospeltangents.com. And if you'd like to check out some of our other conversations, click over here. Thanks.